Hello. Integumentary system, which is skin and various structures associated with the skin. Skin is the largest organ in the body. The largest internal organ is the liver, but largest in general is the skin. Skin covers almost all of the outside of our body. Skin has two main layers. The outside layer, or epidermis, is an epithelium, while the inside layer, or dermis, is a connective tissue. Epidermis is a keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. You saw that in the lab. What does that mean? Epithelium, kind of tissue that covers the surface. Squamous means that most or all cells are flat. Stratified means that there are multiple layers. And keratinized means that at least some of the cells are filled with a protein called keratin. Keratin is going to give those cells stiffness and hardness. The dermis underneath is a dense connective tissue which has fibroblasts, fat cells, adipose cells, adipocytes, as well as a variety of fibers like elastic fibers and collagen fibers. In between epidermis and dermis, there's going to be a thin basement membrane, like every epithelium has a thin basement membrane, which is secreted by the bottom layer of cells in the epithelium and the top layer of cells of the connective tissue underneath. Epithelium has a number of layers, and uh, in this case, it varies how many layers there are depending where on the body you have sampled your skin and made a microscope slide. Okay, so the first layer on top of the basement membrane is called stratum basale, so basal. And what is interesting about stratum basale is that it serves essentially like a source of skin stem cells, right? Because it's producing all the other cells in the skin. Uh, Unlike the rest of the layers, the skin cells in this layer are not squamous. They're cuboidal. They can even be columnar in some places. And they're constantly dividing. And every time one of those cells divides, one of the daughter cells stays right there, attached to the basement membrane, in order to be able to divide again and again and again and again, while the other daughter cell gets pushed towards the surface. And as it gets pushed towards the surface, it changes the way it looks, it changes the structure on the inside. And as the new cells are made underneath, the old cell gets moved up and up and up towards the surface. And as it goes towards the surface, it undergoes a whole bunch of changes. The next layer above stratum basale is the stratum spinosum. Stratum spinosum gets its name because in the early days of histology, the way the slides were made, the way the skin was cut, gave an impression that there were some spines in there. There are no spines. That's an artifact of the preparation of the slide. And in the stratum spinosum, cells are starting to get more flattened, so they're not cuboidal and or columnar anymore. They start to get flattened, and they accumulate lipid. Lipid is accumulated in vesicles, and those vesicles are called lamellar bodies, which comes important a little later as those cells now, migrate further towards the surface and become stratum granulosum. That's the next layer. They are now flat and really squamous. And these cells are starting to accumulate keratin and from keratinocytes that are giving them keratin. And that lipid uh, from the lamellar bodies gets secreted outside of the cells. So there's some of that lipid bathing the cells in the intercellular uh, space between these cells. In the stratum granulosum, the cell nuclei and various other organelles, they start to degenerate. The cells are starting to die. So this layer looks grainy. That's why it's called granulosum. The next layer is stratum lucidum. All the nuclei and all the or other organelles are dead and destroyed, reabsorbed by the cell. So the cell is looking transparent. That's why it's called lucidum. It's clear. We don't see this layer everywhere. We see it in places which have what is called a thick skin. Thick skin can be found on the soles of the feet, on the palms and fingers of the hand, uh, in general, places that need kind of a lot of, they do a lot of interaction with the rest of the world. The thick skin has stratum lucidum, has all five strata, and because there's a lot of friction there, and the skin needs to be thicker. The word thick skin refers to the thickness of the epidermis. The actual thickness of the skin is determined by the dermis, and dermis is 10 to 20 times thicker than the epidermis. Everywhere else, we have thin skin, and thin skin does not have the stratum lucidum. Thin skin is everywhere else, but the stratum granulosum cells go straight to become the cells of the stratum corneum. Stratum corneum is the outward, most superficial layer of the epidermis. It has squamous cells. Now they're completely flat and thin. Those cells are completely dead. They have no internal structure. There are no organelles or anything. And then completely full with keratin that gives them hardness. Uh, they're coated and surrounded by those lipids. Remember that lipids were released from the lamellar bodies of the skin cells from underneath. So those lipids are waterproofing the skin. They're preventing the water from either coming from the outside into the body or by evaporating and losing water we need going from the inside to the out. The stratum corneum can have many, many layers 25, 30, 40 layers, and they're all dead squamous cells. Those cells are connected by desmosomes. Look in the book what that is. And as those more and more layers form, the desmosomes in the outermost layers start breaking apart. Everything is dead here, right? And when they fall apart, those cells get loose. Nothing is holding them together anymore. So they slough off. They get removed. Just regular movement, friction is going to remove them. Sometimes too many cells are sloughed off, and especially on the scalp, on the head, and we call that dandruff. If there's a lot of friction in a particular place, then the skin responds to that by increasing the number of layers in the stratum corneum. So instead of 20, 25, you get 30, 40, 50, 60 layers of those dead squamous cells. And that thickening is called a callus. If the callus is over a bony prominence where the bone is kind of sticking into the skin, then it can form a cone-shaped structure, which is called a corn. So underneath the epidermis is dermis. The dermis is dense, collagenous connective tissue, which has fibroblasts, and macrophages, and adipocytes. And being a connective tissue, contains arteries and veins and capillaries. It contains nerves, contains smooth muscles, all sorts of glands, hair follicles, lymphatic vessels, all those things that an epithelium cannot have, a connective tissue does have. And it provides nutrients and takes away wastes from the epidermis. Uh, and it provides 10 to 20 times as much thickness of the skin than the epidermis does. So it is responsible for the structural properties and all the other properties of the skin. Is the dermis. The collagen and elastic fibers are found in this tissue, and they are oriented in many different ways, like a mesh, uh, resisting stretch in various different directions. But some collagen fibers are oriented in some directions more than the others in different part of the body, and those are called tension lines or cleavage lines in the skin. So in every part of the body, the skin is more resistant to stretch in one direction than in some other directions. So, like surgeons need to cut along cleavage lines and not across. Because if you make a cross, it's harder for the dermis to heal than if you cut along the cleavage lines. Uh, if the skin is overstretched, let's say you bulk up really, really fast, or you're pregnant, so parts of your skin stretch really fast, then the dermis damages, and it kind of tears up along those cleavage lines, and those cleavage lines can then be seen under the epidermis, and those lines are called stretch marks. Um, the upper part of the dermis, uh, the one that is touching the basal membrane of the epidermis, is not flat. It has peaks and valleys. It's like a bunch of little mountains, and those little mountains are called dermal papillae. And dermal papillae go into the epidermis, and those papillae are full of blood vessels and nerves and all sorts of other things, and they are providing nutrients to the epidermis. They're taking the wastes away from the epidermis. Uh, in some parts of the body, those papillae, instead of being a mountain here, a mountain here, a mountain here, a mountain here, they're lined up and they form ridges, and those ridges curve around. Those ridges can then be felt and seen from the outside, because they're also going to shape the epidermis above it. The epidermis is thin, and those ridges are going to push some parts of epidermis up, and some of them stays down. Those ridges are called friction ridges because they allow us to have better friction, and they're found on hands, especially fingertips, and on feet, especially the tips of the toes. Those are fingerprints that are unique to every individual. Um, there are pigments in the skin, and they provide color to the skin. Uh, Melanin is the main pigment, and melanin it's a group. It's really a class of pigments, and most of them are brown to black in color, but some can be yellow or red. Different people are going to have different types of melanin, and they're going to have different quantities of melanin in the melanocytes in the skin. Uh, Melanocytes are cells that produce melanin, and then they release it and inject it. The melanin molecule gets transported from melanocytes into all the other cells of the stratum spinosum and rest of the epidermis. So If you have a little extra melanin in some parts, you might get freckles or moles. There's more melanin in some parts of the body, like around the genitals, on the nipples, and around them. Other parts of the body have less melanin, so they're pale, like the palms and soles of the feet. Lips are a little paler than the rest of the body. Uh, how much melanin is going to be produced depends on a number of factors. One is genetics, another is hormones, another is exposure to sunlight. Uh, so, exposure to sunlight, to ultraviolet light, is going to trigger the is going to stimulate MSH, melanin stimulating hormone, from the pars intermedia of the pituitary gland, which we are going to talk about soon, and it's going to increase the production of melanin in the melanocytes, thus darkening the skin. That's sun tanning. Um, there are kind of trade-offs to there as far as genetics. People who live in parts of or originate from the parts of the planet where there's a lot of sun are going to have genetically darker skin to protect the underlying skin from the ultraviolet radiation, while people who originated from parts of the planet where there's not that much sun are going to have much less melanin because there's not as much danger uh, from ultraviolet damage coming from the sun. This is important because ultraviolet radiation also stimulates production of vitamin D in the skin. It's a precursor of vitamin D, which then goes to the liver where it's modified, and then goes to the kidney where it's modified completely to vitamin D. Vitamin D is very important because it stimulates the extraction of phosphorus and calcium out of food in the digestive tract. And calcium and phosphorus are important for the development of the bone. If there's a lack of vitamin D in childhood, the child develops a disorder called the rickets, where the bones are not fully formed, they're curvy, they don't have enough strength to remain straight. Let's say you're standing and walking, and those legs kind of splay, and those bones get curved because there's not enough calcium and phosphate in the bones, and that's because of the lack of vitamin D. So there's a trade-off there. If there's a lot of sun and you get a lot of sunlight, and the way your skin gets darker, you get a lot of suntan. That melanin is going to protect the skin. That also means less ultraviolet light can pass through the melanin and trigger the production of vitamin D. So darker the skin, harder to produce that vitamin D. Lighter the skin, easier to produce vitamin D. So there's a trade-off there between, well, protection from ultraviolet light, which can cause cancer and all sorts of other damage in your skin cells. And underneath, on the other hand, you need ultraviolet to produce vitamin D. So if you are not constantly outside, expose yourselves to sun, you need to supplement vitamin D. Fatty fishes and fish oil, the are good supplement, or you can take the pills, or the vitamin D enriched milk are good sources of vitamin D. We wear clothes, and often even when we go outside, we put hats and sunscreen and all sorts of other things, and we're covered completely, so we don't get as much of production of vitamin D from our skin as if we were just like running around naked. So we also don't spend as much time outside these days. I mean, I do because I teach horseback riding lessons, but even then, I'm not out there 24 hours a day. And a lot of people who work inside, in offices, in factories, in classrooms, they barely see the sun, so they definitely need to supplement their diet with vitamin D, which is necessary for the health of bones. Um, Let me see. Underneath the skin is a tissue that's called subcutaneous tissue that does not belong to the skin. It's much looser connective tissue than the dermis, and it just connects the dermis to the underlying muscle or bone. It has a lot of adipocytes, a lot of fatty tissue uh, in the subcutaneous tissue. Okay, hair. Hair is found everywhere on the skin, except on the palms, on the soles, on the lips, on the nipples, a couple of other places. So each hair has a hair follicle, which is kind of a hole in the epidermis that extends deep into the dermis. It's like you're pushing the epidermis into the dermis, and so the length of the hair, whatever is you can see on the outside, is called a shaft. What is underneath is below the surface is called a root, which expands to form a hair bulb. If you look in the textbook, you'll see that there's like arteries and veins going into the bulb. There's also sort of layers. The shaft has a medulla in the middle, cortex around it, and the surface of the hair is called a cuticle. Epithelial cells that there. There's a stem epithelial cells. If there's a damage in the skin, they can be used to make more skin. There is a muscle, a small, smooth muscle associated with each hair, and that muscle is called erector pili. Erector pili is the one that gives you goosebumps. So when it contracts, the hair moves, it gets straighter, and it gives you goosebumps. It also each hair also has associated with it some glands, including the sebaceous glands. We're going to get into that in just a second. Okay, so glands in the skin are sebaceous glands and sweat glands. So sebaceous glands are simple, branched, acinar glands. You're going to look at them on a model of skin in the lab, and they're connected by duct to the hair follicle. They produce sebum. Sebum is an oily substance. It's white. It's rich in lipids. It's a fat. Uh, and it lubricates the hair and the surface of the skin. So it's the skin oils, right? Uh, so it prevents the skin from dying. It can protect against some of the bacteria. It has some antibacterial properties. Sweat glands come in two types, eccrine and apocrine, and you actually need to know this. Eccrine and apocrine sweat glands, both of them are simple, they're coiled, they're tubular glands, uh, more merocrine secretion, so they look alike a lot, each other a lot, but there's a difference in what they secrete. Eccrine glands are everywhere, and most of them are in the palms and the soles, but you can find them everywhere. That's what you think when you say sweat glands. That's what you're talking about. So they will secrete sweat, which is mostly water with some salts, and those sweat glands have ducts that open on the surface, and those openings are called sweat pores, and you can see them if you look careful at the skin, maybe with a magnifying glass. You don't even need a microscope. Um, so the sweat glands are going to produce sweat mostly to evaporate liquid. Evaporating liquid takes the energy, right? It's a kind of a chemical, a physical process that requires energy. Where does the energy come from? From our body heat. So when we are overheating, we're going to secrete the liquid. That liquid is going to evaporate, and that evaporation is going to take the heat away from us. It's going to take the energy out of us. So that is the main role for the eccrine sweat glands. Apocrine sweat glands are different. They are they have first they're found in only very limited parts of the body, in the armpits around genitalia, and they don't start secreting until they hit puberty because it requires reproductive hormones, the sex steroid hormones, to trigger their activity. Uh, because they have all sorts of organic molecules in them, it's easy for bacteria that live on a skin to break down those proteins and fats and sugars. And those breakdown products do have a smell, and that is what is called body, body odor. We're not going to talk about nails. Okay, so what does the skin do? It has all sorts of functions. First is protection, right? It's protecting the internal organs from all sorts of things that can come from the outside. Hits and scratches, and your cat is biting you. It protects you from losing too much water or gaining too much water if you're swimming. Uh, it protects you from bacteria coming in and other microorganisms from foreign substances of all sorts of kinds entering the body. Uh, it protects from ultraviolet light and protects from all sorts of other things. Um, so the hair also has a protective roles, uh, hair on the body, eyebrows, eyelashes, hairs in the nose and ears. They all prevent, dirt and dust coming into the holes of various parts of the body, protect us from sun. Uh, there are a number of sensory organs in the skin. Uh, you are going to look at that model of skin in the lab, and we're going to look at Merkel's and Meissner's and Pacini's corpuscles and the naked endings of nerves, uh, and all those different types of sensory receptors in the skin can detect pain, heat and cold, pressure, vibration, those kinds of things. Um, there are uh, these kinds of nerve endings associated with each hair as well. The shaft of the hair is dead. If you can cut it, but if you try to pull a hair out, it's going to pull on the nerve, and that nerve is a sensory receptor, and so you're going to detect that as pain. We already talked about the production of vitamin D, which is essential for development of the bones because of absorption of calcium and phosphorus out of the digestive system, and the skin does that. Skin is also involved in temperature regulation. There's a lot of arteries and veins and capillaries in those dermal papilla right underneath the epidermis, and those blood vessels are going to expand, open up, and expand, uh, and thus fill up with blood, which is going to radiate heat into the outside environment, and that's going to happen when we are overheating. If you're too cold, those arteries and veins and capillaries are going to shrink. They're going to vasoconstrict, right? They're going to shrink. Many of the capillaries will just close. The skin becomes paler, and there's not as much heat, hot blood going through the surface. There's less heat is radiated into the outside air. Um, some of those skin glands and sebaceous glands can also excrete some small amounts of urea, uric acid, and ammonia. That's not a big contribution to the excretion in the body, but it does so. So, this is pretty much all you need to know about the skin, both for the lecture exam as well as in the lab. We are going to look at the slides of the skin and a big model of the skin where we're going to look at all those structures. Thank you.